Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm Mary Rajkumar. I'm the International Investigations Editor for the Associated Press, and I'm also a governor on the Overseas Press Club board. So I am here today with two very distinguished journalists. One of them, Anand Gopal, is a writer for The New Yorker, a member of the OPC since 2016, and a four-time winner of the OPC's Ed Cunningham Award for Best Magazine-Style Long-Form Feature Writing. Anand has also written a book that was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And Anand's editor, Harper's, was the first prominent magazine to publish Anand's work under editor Chris Cox. And they published a story about Syria and a story about Afghanistan. Chris is now at New York Magazine after stints at Harper's, GQ, and the New York Times Magazine. He's worked on stories that have won the Pulitzer Prize, multiple magazine awards, also the Ed Cunningham Award, etc. So I am very pleased and honored to be here with them. So we'll get started because we don't have a lot of time. This panel is called How I Did It. So I'd like to take that both in the big sense of the word and the micro sense. So in the big sense, I think what a lot of people would like to know is how did Anand break into the kind of stories he's doing? And we now know we have Chris to thank for that, but I would love to know more. And then I think in the micro sense, I really would love to know a lot more about Anand's process and also what you look for, Chris, in terms of finding a narrative, shaping the narrative, what sort of reporting goes into it, etc. So why don't we start? Anand, do you want to give us a really sort of a quick synopsis of how you got into this kind of work? You're a sociologist by training, and you are an academic. How did you get into writing, and how did you eventually end up meeting Chris?
Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, actually, in my first career, I was a physicist, or basically doing physical sciences, math and physics. And I lived in New York during 9/11, during the attacks, and I saw the attacks. And like a lot of us, I was very affected by what I saw, and I started to follow the news, especially about the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq, pretty closely. And eventually, a few years later, I decided that I should try to go to one of these countries and try to understand better myself what's going on. I didn't really have a ambition of being a journalist or a writer at that point. I just kind of wanted to go. So I went to Afghanistan, as it turned out. And once there, I started to freelance, and that's how I kind of fell into it.
Okay. So Anand and Chris, can you tell me about how the two of you first got together? I understand it included a recommendation. And Chris, would you tell me what you found striking and persuasive about Anand's initial pitch? So Anand, you want to talk about the recommendation?
Well, maybe Chris should talk about it.
I was going to say, actually, Chris, maybe you
remember it better than I do.
Yeah, maybe you didn't even know about it. Or at least you didn't know the wording of the email that I got. But yes, no, Anand was sent to me via Matthew Akins, who is another reporter who's probably a lot of the people here have read his work before, but he was reporting mainly from Afghanistan at the time, and had written some things for Harper's Magazine, where I was an editor. And I edited one of those stories by the time that he recommended Anand to me. And he just sent me an email, and he said something along the lines of, Anand is a brilliant reporter and probably my closest competition here in Afghanistan, so I'd rather he be writing for Harper's than anywhere else. And I got that email, and then very quickly set up a meeting with Anand. I thought the best way to sort of get to know him, because he was at that moment in New York, would be to meet face to face. I think it was even like just 2 days after that first email that we met. And that's by no means a requirement to, get a relationship going with an editor, but it was helpful to have that. We could sort of talk in a more like freewheeling way about what he was interested in, the work he'd done before, that kind of stuff. but then it was still a good 6 months or something before he sent me a pitch that ended up getting assigned. So it took a little bit of back and forth before we arrived at our first story, which is about Syria. But in some other ways, it's kind of quick to go from first meeting to assigned magazine story in 6 months. So, I was grateful to Matt for setting the whole process on its way.
So, by the way, I have warned Matthew Akins that he will be flooded with requests for recommendations.
Yeah.
So he does know that. So I was going to ask, so tell me more about that Syria pitch and more in general about the pitches. Where do they come from? Was that something that you had found, Anand? And if so, what was your process? Had you already been to Syria at the time? Or was it something that you and Chris talked about and you said, hey, I have this great idea that I'd love to go to Syria? What was the process? How did that pitch come across?
So this would have been, I think, 2011, 2012, in that period. So the Arab Spring was in full force. And so I was reporting on that for various outlets. And I had been in Libya and Egypt. Chris, if I remember, we started actually talking about Egypt initially.
Yep.
Battered on some ideas about Egypt, and then and I'd been wanting to go to Syria at the same time, and so eventually I decided to go to Syria. And at that point in the Syrian conflict, most of the territories on the Turkish border were under the control of the Syrian regime, so it was tricky getting in. But so I didn't want to pitch anything before knowing I can get in, because I didn't know what the story would be, except that I was there. So I went to Turkey and hung out there for a little while and met some Syrians who had fled and other activists, Syrian activists and others, and eventually went across the border with them. And then once there, I went to a town that had just witnessed a massacre by the Syrian government. And I think I went into that town a few days after the massacre. So now obviously I knew that I had a pitchable story. So then when I left, that's when I wrote to Chris.
Okay. And how at that point did you guys handle the story? As in, Anand, when you wrote to Chris, did you already have a pretty clear idea of what it was going to be? Or was that something that you and Chris discussed? How did you handle discussions on what the structure was going to be, the main characters? Because it strikes me in this case, it sounds like you did a majority of the reporting before you actually got out. So how did you handle that? And did you ever find that Chris wanted to know things that you hadn't reported on?
Yeah, in this case, I think I reported the entire story before the pitch, just by the nature of being
I'll
Syria
put the trip pause.
But Chrissy, do you remember some of the details? You probably remember better than I do.
Yes, and I went back and looked at some of our correspondence to refresh my memory. So yeah, it's very unusual for a story, for a pitch to arrive after all the reporting has been done. Normally, it's an idea of a reporting project, and then the editor will say yes or no. In this case, yeah, because of what Anand said about going into Syria, that wasn't the way it worked. So I knew that we had basically only to work with what he had seen while he was there. But he'd seen a lot. So, I mean, the bulk of that story is just his pure on the ground, like reporting of what he saw, who he talked to. In an ideal world, sure, maybe we would have had follow-up interviews, that kind of stuff, but it just obviously wasn't possible. And so the structural work we did, I think Anna pitched the story, and it was like beautifully written pitch, and got the assignment pretty quickly, basically because of that. Really like vivid descriptive writing in the pitch itself. And then after the story was assigned, I just asked him, okay, great, let's talk about how the story is going to be actually told. And he wrote an outline. And then we did a little bit of back and forth on the outline, basically saying like, okay, this block of information goes here, maybe these two can be combined, that kind of stuff. And then we agreed on the basic structure of the story. And then he got to work on a draft, and pretty quickly after that, a couple of weeks, it was done, or the first draft was done.
Okay. Anand, so Chris, it sounds like, as you're saying, most of the time you work with reporters before they go in and report the story. Anand, is that usually the case for you? I mean, how do you decide what stories you want to do? And, do you normally talk to an editor before you go in, while you're there? How does that process work for you?
Yeah, I think the Syria case was unusual. And also probably not to be recommended. It's because I have to say a lot of journalists ended up going in those years and getting kidnapped and other such things because they were going in and trying to do all the reporting and pitch something. But yeah, so I prefer to sort of talk things through beforehand. And I typically that's what I've done. I like to find good characters. I like to find good narrative arcs, and something has a beginning, a middle, and end. That sounds compelling to me. And sometimes I'll find something that's really interesting news-wise, but I don't always find the right characters or narrative arc, or I find a really good character, but they're really hard to fact check for whatever purpose, or they're really hard to try, so there's a lot of different factors that go into it. But the main thing is I'm looking for what would be a good character or a good narrative arc, usually.
How do you decide where to go? Because one thing that struck me, you mentioned fact checking. One thing that struck me about your work is the tremendous amount of research that goes into it. Can you talk a little bit more? How do you figure out where to go, and what kind of research do you do even before you go?
So I mean, I haven't reported in that many places, to be honest. I mean, I reported in a lot of the Arab worlds, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Libya, and Afghanistan. And so with Iraq and Afghanistan, I was primarily drawn by the fact that we were at war there. So to me, it was trying to tell an aspect of our involvement, and so that's why I was drawn there. But the Arab Spring, I was drawn by the idea of this revolution, or these revolutions for democracy, and interested in seeing what it looks like for people to try to struggle for democracy under pretty adverse conditions. And so both of these, whether the American wars or democracy, are things that are very relevant, obviously, to us here. So that's kind of where I've been drawn to, and I do tend to do a lot of research. I learned the languages I learned Arabic, and I also learned the languages in Afghanistan, because it just changes what you're able to access if you can speak the languages, especially in the Arab world, where you have lots of written material, newspapers, you have videos. There's a lot of resources you can draw from. So that's definitely a big part of it. And I also like to read a lot of the scholarship, even though most of it won't directly be in the piece, but it helps me understand what sorts of questions I should be asking to people when I'm reporting.
And so this would be the academic scholarship. So before you go to the place, you go through the academic scholarship one.
I try to read everything I can get my hands on that's been written by scholars about a place. Yeah,
that's a lot. But yeah. Okay. So another thing that I'm curious about, how does your training as a sociologist actually affect the way you report and write, or does it? I mean, I would imagine, for example, that the thoroughness of the research is very much something that's ingrained in you, and very much something that you do by nature. Are there other ways where you can see a crossover between those two fields, essentially?
I think so. I got my PhD in sociology actually after I started writing for Chris. So I went back and did my degree while continuing to be a journalist. And I did learn a lot in terms of how to be a better journalist from sociological research, just like reading a lot of ethnographies, looking at ethnographic approaches, which tend to be very, very micro-history oriented. I'm really drawn by the idea of trying to tell large stories by zooming into a very particular place or a particular family or particular individuals. Definitely, I think I got that from sociology.
Interesting. So, Chris, tell us a bit more too about when you get a bunch of pitches, what normally catches your eye? And let's start with that. What usually strikes you? I'm sure it's a wide range of things, but what do you look for?
Yeah, so I mean, Anand is in some ways a good example and a bad example at the same time, because he came sort of fully formed in a variety of different ways. Like, he was already writing very polished prose. In the case of the Syria story, you know, he had already done the reporting. But the ways in which he's similar to other writers, I'm looking for two things, basically. One is, do they have an interesting story to pitch, like one that actually seems like it will sustain a, 5,000 words, 6,000 words, 7,000 words, a long form treatment. That means usually, as Anand has said, like having a narrative arc, characters, those kind of things tend to keep those kinds of stories aloft. And then fine, I like the story idea. I start looking for assurances of one form or another that the writer can actually complete that story in a satisfactory way. So that includes, if it's before they've done the reporting, like, will they be able to get to where they want to get to and talk to people they want to talk to? I'm also definitely looking at the writing at that stage. Harper's is a very writer-focused magazine. Like, we want the writers to have their own voices and for them to be strong voices. And so I will, even in a casual email, I'm looking at the language a little bit, and then definitely in the pitch itself, it's the moment to sort of showcase your command of arresting details, good use of concrete language. It's probably not the time to let loose with your most beautiful florid prose, but you definitely want to show that you know your way around a sentence. Certainly, like at Harper's especially, we've said no to ideas that were good ideas that we just thought the writer, there's no way that they could pull it off.
Oh, interesting. So how do you guys handle funding? I mean, for example, Anand, it sounds like in some cases you go to the place before you get a contract with the magazine, and is that typical? Chris, do you often fund writers up front? How does the funding usually work? Anand, you want to start?
So it really depends. In the Syria case, if I recall, I had other assignments, like newspaper assignments that brought me to Turkey that I could report on refugees. So I was kind of using one assignment to get me from one place to the next. An assignment that brought me to Egypt, and I was there for a while, back and forth, and then next to Turkey to report on Syria. And then I think in the entire time that I've been a journalist, I've never had more than half my income come from journalism. So I've always had other sources of income. Now I'm a professor, so that's a source of income. Or before, I would write reports for aid organizations or NGOs or whatever side hustle you could find. So that was part of it as well. But I don't like to, again, like the Syria example, I think is an atypical one. I don't like to have the entire story reported or have everything funded.
Okay. And Chris?
So for the Syria story, it was all reported, but I think after the fact, Harper's paid for your expenses. And Harper's would, in a normal situation, set a budget ahead of time and say, like, okay, you want to go to Syria for 2 weeks, like, what's that going to cost? And then, Harper's is a nonprofit magazine. If it was too expensive, then we would often reach out to other organizations to try to secure help with funding. Like the Pulitzer Center would fund this kind of reporting, or if it was an investigative story, like what was then known as the Nation Institute, I think now is Type Investigations. We would look for or ProPublica. We would look for like outside partners, basically. When I've been at magazines like GQ or the New York Times Magazine, and now at New York, there's a bigger budget for supporting reporting. So the magazine itself will usually cover all the expenses. But yeah, Anand definitely went about the whole thing backwards. In fact, I remember with this assignment, because it was all done, I just put 0 on the contract for the amount of expenses because I thought, well, however, whatever magic he's worked to get there and report the story, he's already worked it. So I guess we don't have to pay anything.
And everybody is like, great, we'll take this one, 0.
Yeah, exactly. And then many months later, I think the story was already published. And Anand was like, oh, by the way, like there were some expenses, of course, going to Syria. Could the magazine cover those? And I said, well, have you returned your contract yet? And he said, actually, no, it's sitting here on my desk. So I had to like cross out the 0 and put in, some whatever.
Yeah, put in
we're able to pay him back.
Actual. So what happens when you're on assignment? Like, Anand, do you talk to editors, and Chris, do you talk to reporters while they are there? In other words, is the story sort of shaped on the fly? Like I find sometimes with reporters that they might go in, for example, the story's not quite what they think, or they can't decide between a few main characters, or or numerous other things. Does that happen, or when you go, are you pretty much just immersed in the situation? And Anand, do you want to start again?
Yeah, I think both have happened.
Okay.
Probably in Chris's case, I think the 2 stories were more formed, would you say, Chris, than
in Kandahar, we talked sort of in between the 2 chunks of your reporting, right? You'd been arrested and kicked out of Kandahar, and then we talked right before you went back for your second trip, basically.
Right. Yeah. So this is an example. This would have been 2013 or 14, and yeah, I think I'd done part of the reporting, and then we talked it through after that, and I did the second half.
Okay. I'd love to focus a little bit more on your other women story, which I think, has gotten a lot of attention, and I think is a bit of a microcosm of, what you do with some of your work. I'm really interested to know more about how, in this case, you interviewed rural women who normally would never talk to a male stranger. How did you get to them? And how did you persuade them to talk to you? And when they did, was it in the presence of anybody else?
Yeah, so this is I had been wanting for years to try to sort of crack this code and get to talk to rural women. I remember I lived in Afghanistan for 3 years, and in 2008 to 2011. And while I was living there, sometimes what I would do is I would my friend had a taxi, and I would sit in the back of the taxi, and he would just go and pick people up in the countryside. And often you have women or men or whoever sit in the taxi, and my friend would just start a conversation with them about the war, about what's going on. And these are like not in the areas where most of the reporters are. This is out in the middle of basically where the fighting is. And the things that I would hear really shocked me. It really changed a lot of my perceptions, because I had women saying all sorts of things about wanting the troops out and hating what the Americans are doing. So from that moment, and I would just sit there kind of mute in the corner listening to what they're saying, not because at that point, if they knew I was a foreigner, I think they would stop talking. So that really kind of laid the seeds for me to get really interested in like what's the story about. And then when the withdrawal was announced in 2021, I had been in touch with some people in southern Afghanistan, and through them I met some of their grandmothers, essentially. And so the restrictions in southern Afghanistan are pretty rigid, except when it comes to elderly women. And so some of these women were able to speak. I spoke to one of them initially, I think over Skype or something, and then eventually when I got on the ground, I was able to talk to some of these grandmothers, in some cases with their relatives around, but in some cases without anybody around. And in some cases, we actually had a partition between me and the person who was talking. And it was through the grandmothers that eventually, after I won their trust a little bit, that they were able to refer me to other women who were younger. And so in that way, I think in the end, something like 30, 35 women, I can't remember the exact number, but there's a large number of women that I was able to interview and just get their life stories in that way.
And did you do it with an interpreter, or do you speak the language well enough to do it?
I speak the language, although not nearly as well as I used to. It used to be when I was living in Afghanistan, I could like I said, with this in the taxi example, I would just sit and
Right. You could actually understand. Yeah.
Where I think but now is a little different. One, because it's been so many years, but two, also, what I really needed some help and guidance in, especially some of the cultural mores, and which sometimes especially because I'm dealing with women, that the person who's with me can phrase in the right way, can put in the right context. And so some of the interviews I had somebody with me, and so they were helping a lot in phrasing things in the right way.
Okay. And have you ever, I think you also spent some time, 10 years ago, embedding with the Taliban. How did that happen? How did you get there? And also, did you feel that, how do you maintain enough objectivity when you're embedding with the Taliban, as in presumably that gives you more of a Taliban view into the country? How did that happen?
Well, the point wasn't the point was to get the Taliban view in the country. That was like,
yeah.
But the way it happened is, so, when I moved to the country, the biggest kind of gap I felt in a lot of the coverage is we just did not know what was going on the other side, right? There was this huge war going on. A lot of reporters, myself included, were going and embedding with the US troops and getting the American troops' perspective. And so the question was, okay, what is actually happening on the other side? And so it took me a while to figure out how to do it safely. And initially it was because I started visiting the main prison in Kabul, where there was some Taliban and Al-Qaeda members who were there. And I think for months went and hung out with them, talked to them, and eventually won their trust a little bit. And realized that I wasn't a spy. I wasn't working for the CIA. I was basically who I said I was. And so then they connected me with their brothers or cousins or whoever who were out in the field and fighting. So that's how I got to them. And then once I got with them, I was just with them, and one person says it's kind of like local culture. They prize hospitality, etc. So you come and stay at their house, and then they kind of protect you while you're there. And so it gave me a totally different view, obviously, of the conflict.
Yeah, that is interesting. And how do you normally decide on a main character? It sounds like you talked to multiple characters beforehand, and normally, give us some sense for when you report, how many people do you, it sounds like you talk to dozens of people, but what makes you feel that you've researched a topic well enough to write?
So in the other Afghan women case, I can't remember the exact number, but maybe 24 or something women I ended up interviewing. And in most of those cases, I took their entire life story. So I spent hours and hours with them as if they were going to be the main character,
Wow.
And I was able to kind of see who can remember good details and kind of checkable details, who can, some people will have witnessed a lot, but they're just going to be a jumble of different anecdotes, and it's very hard to parse through. Some people will be very clear, oh, this happened on such and such time when the British forces were in the village. So then I can go and check, okay, what are the dates in which the British forces were in the village? So I'm really looking for ways I can check. I'm looking for people who, when they witness things, they have other people that I can reach that have witnessed the same thing. So in the other Afghan woman, there was a scene where the main character, Shakira, she fires at a tank, right?
Right.
And so it was very important for me to be able to find other people in the village who could corroborate that, for example. And there are equally interesting stories from other women, which I couldn't necessarily corroborate, not necessarily because they were making it up, but just because it was difficult to corroborate for one reason or another.
So you chose one that you could corroborate. Also, how do you handle, your stories are very vivid, and you sometimes rely on direct quotes. How do you get that? And how do you basically build in enough rigidity to know that you can use a quote like that? Do you check it with several people? What do you do?
Direct quote in the sense of
like something she yelled, or
right.
yeah.
It depends what it is. I mean, if it's something obvious that she yelled, I'll probably just take her word for it. But if it's something that it seems like it could be, contentious, or it's something that seems like it could be like said a different way, then I would probably need to check it,
Yeah.
especially if it's dialogue with the second person,
Yeah.
that kind
Yeah,
of thing.
then you would.
Yeah.
What's the biggest challenge that you faced? It sounds like you faced a fair number, but what would you say is the biggest challenge you face, or the biggest challenge that you face every time in trying to craft a narrative in these areas that are difficult to get into and difficult to access?
There's a lot of challenges. I mean, access, getting into so when I went for the other Afghan women's story, it was entirely in Taliban controlled territory. And my being able to get there was the result of 10 or 12 years of reporting on the country and having contacts, so it's hard to get access sometimes. I'm writing a book on Syria, and one of the challenges I have in that book is just that there's a lot of people who'd rather forget, a lot of Syrians, and you want to be very sensitive to not wanting to re-traumatize them, not wanting to, to be sensitive, to be aware of what they're going through. There's a lot of people who are afraid still, they've witnessed all sorts of things, and they're afraid of reprisals from the Syrian government or the Iranians or whoever. So these days, that's the biggest kind of challenge that I face.
How do you handle that? I mean, how far do you know? I think this is something reporters face to different degrees. When you have somebody who's traumatized, how do you know how far you can push or not?
Well, I'll give an example. There's this woman that I'm writing about in my book, and after months and months of searching, I found her father. This woman has gone missing, and I found her father. And her father, I explained to him what I'm doing. He consented to the interview, and then he started to describe the last time he saw his daughter, which was she was arrested by ISIS, and ISIS had brought him in front of her cell, and they were beating her while he was forced to watch.
Oh God!
He was telling me the story, and he broke down crying. And when he broke down, I felt like, God, this is terrible what I'm doing. I shouldn't. And even though he agreed to the interview, so I stopped the interview at that point. And I decided that if I'm going to report on her, I'm going to do it without him. So I never interviewed him again.
Wow.
Even though he's a great source.
Did you use the material? Did you use the material that you had already gotten from him, or did you just,
Yeah, in fact, I wrote that scene into the book, basically.
You wrote that scene, yeah.
I basically said I've interviewed him and stopped. And
Oh God, yeah. No, I think dealing with traumatized people is always one of the more difficult things that we face in reporting. I wanted to ask too that, where did you, in terms of writing, what do you read yourself, and how? I mean, I've read that you have a pile of writing around when you write yourself. What do you read, and what inspires you?
Well, in terms of writing, I think even before any of that, it's like I learned a lot from having a great editor like Chris, like kind of having, just every time. And that first piece on Syria was the first real like long form piece I'd written, and I learned a tremendous amount. And then the next time I learned a lot. And so I think just that process, one learns a lot. But then also, I try to read a lot of, I read a lot of fiction these days, mostly just because if I'm writing about prisons, I'll try to read books,
prison fiction,
prisons, anything to try to get my headspace into the right thing. I'm always looking for how writers dealt with certain challenges, things like how do you deal with pacing, how do you deal with withholding detail and unveiling detail in the right time. And there's a lot one can learn from great writers. So that's mostly what I do. And so I don't write anything without having like I said, a pile of writing I admire too, like I can kind of be inspired by.
And you just like sort of refer to it every time you get stuck?
When I have my daily bouts of writer's block, I'll just read good writing for a while.
What's the process in terms? Do you have a daily process, and how long a day do you like? Do you have a certain period that you write for every day, or what's your? what's your process in doing that?
Yeah, I try to write 1,000 words a day. I'm writing a book now, so it's not 1,000 good words, but I just try to get words down on paper, which is different. I used to be somebody who tried to get the sentence just right and then move on to the next one, but then it just takes forever. So I've learned now to throw everything on the page and sort it out later. So yeah, I might try to aim for 1,000 words a day, and my day ends when the 1,000 words is reached. Doesn't matter when that is.
Okay. Chris, as an editor, do you, when you're working with reporters, do you ever feel you want to go there?
Very rarely. Oh. But that's the nature of some of the stuff that I'm working on. Like, I don't get to edit a lot of Hawaii travel packages.
You want to go to Syria?
Yeah.
I could.
I mean, it's certainly, like, as an editor, there have been situations where I feel like I would actually be better at my job if I had more direct experience of what the reporter is seeing. You know, I have traveled several, like, around the world, so there are stories where I feel more plugged in than I was, for example, on the Syria story, where I've never been to Syria. It can be an advantage, but, you know, almost the flip side of that is, like, the average reader is not going to have ever been to Syria. And so I'm basically the first reader of this story, and the writer needs to make it clear to me, get it across to me. And so insider knowledge can actually be a hindrance to some extent. But
your job is also,
and he was very good at never making it feel like he you know, was speaking some coded language that, you know, the reader has to decipher. It was very clearly written from the very beginning, both the stories that we worked on.
That makes sense. I wanted to ask you guys one other thing, because I think people's hearts probably sank when they heard that even Anand gets only 50% of his income from writing. It's like, oh my God, if that's true for Anand, you know, what's that like for everybody else? So, and Chris, you've talked also about how it's harder now. So I wanted to ask you guys to sort of walk a fine line between, you know, acknowledging for people that it is harder, but also not having everyone give up hope that, you know, that this is still a very rewarding thing to do if you can get into it. So would you guys address the sort of the two sides of that coin? Chris, why don't you start on this one?
Sure. It's harder. I do think that's true. There are fewer publications, period, and there are fewer that are paying what they, you know, they're paying enough to support the amount of effort that goes into a lot of these projects. But if you're lucky enough to get an assignment from the New Yorker or from the New York Times Magazine, and even from Harper's, which pays less than both of those places, you know, that there will be, you do get paid for your work, and you can get your expenses paid. I think that maybe one way in that it's gotten better, and Anand might be able to speak to this better than I do, is the sort of, like, now that people are no longer expecting individual publications to pick up the, like, to support an entire universe of writers, basically, there's a bigger ecosystem of other sources of funding. It's bad news in that you have to be, like, a real hustler as a writer to, like, you know, line up your, like, you know, travel grant, and then your some stipend, and then also get the assignment, you get the fee from there. But, like, there are a lot of options out there for places that want to support journalism. And I mean, for example, I'm on the prize committee at for an NYU reporting prize that gives, you know, a substantial grant to support this kind of work. And, you know, I don't think that kind of stuff existed back in the, like, if the glory days existed, I don't think that these sort of things were around, because they didn't need to be. So with the right amount of, like, knowledge and hustle, I think a reporter can still accomplish this work without having to, you know, be independently wealthy or whatever, find some other way to support themselves.
Anand, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's definitely, it feels like there's more more of a diversity of sources now.
Mm.
There's also, I'd say one big change from when I started is also more of a diversity of voices and viewpoints today than there was, and especially in my corner of foreign reporting. Sometimes it was challenging in my early days, especially when I was writing for newspapers, to report, to convey things as I saw them, because there was a heavy influence of the national security apparatus on a lot of reporting. And I think that's really opened up a lot, honestly, in the last few years. And I found that one can say truths that were more difficult than before. And also in terms of the 50% of my income, there's a plus side to that too, which is that like I ended up helping my journalism a lot by learning. I developed sources so I would do something for the United Nations or whatever, right? And then I developed great sources in the UN, or so in many ways it helped inform and strengthen my reporting to have a diversity of income sources.
Oh, that's interesting. That makes sense. Well, I want to make sure that there's enough time for questions. So let me throw it open. So everyone, if you'd like to ask, please do send in a question to the chat. And we have a couple already. So let's start with this one. The standard that has emerged post-Foley and post-Sotloff is that an assigning editor takes some sort of responsibility for sending a young reporter into a hostile environment. That has been established by the ACOS movement. So what understanding did the two of you have pre-reporting? Well, I guess but the Syria thing would already come back, so it didn't apply.
It's a good question, actually. I wondered it myself. Like, what would he have done if this had been pitched when Anand was, across the border in Turkey, but wanted to go to Syria? We might have said no, but we sort of dodged that ethical dilemma because the reporting was done when we talked. It came up more directly in the Kandahar story because Anand had been imprisoned in Kandahar and had been told to leave by the police there. And so there were real risks about him returning there, and we talked about that briefly, whether it was a good idea to return, and then I actually just saw this correspondence again, and there was a discussion that where Anand was basically like, I think I can do this safely, and then he talked about some of the like the local sources and fixers that he'd be using to navigate basically around like police checkpoints and that kind of stuff. And then, gosh, I should know this more concretely than I do, but Harper's had like insurance for reporters that were working on assignment for us if they needed to do like medical evacuation or any sort of like extraction like that. Yeah, I mean, it remains like a very. I agree with the idea that like the publication is responsible and should be responsible for the reporters that has working for them in dangerous places.
Here's the thing that always ends tripping me up. It's not just the safety of the reporter, but the safety of the people around them, the people you mentioned, the fixers, the drivers, even the people we interview. How do you take precautions to make sure that, once we leave, that those people are still safe? Either of you, Chris, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. I am definitely curious to hear some of what Anand does, but I mean, in both of the stories that we've published, basically anyone who could have been, that we thought could be at risk, we changed their names, obscured identifying details. Well, I guess I'll let Anand speak to how he helped them remain safe when he was in their company.
I think, yeah, on the ground, my number one rule is that I would never, I never push anybody I'm with to do anything. And I've been in circumstances where I've seen sometimes reporters, sometimes like the person they're with will say, oh, I don't know. And he'd be like, no, it's going to be fine. And they push. And you never, ever, ever want to be in a situation where you're trying to convince somebody else to do something that might be risky. And so, yeah, that's been my most important rule. But yeah, then beyond that, if we pass that rule, then it means that the person we're working with is comfortable enough with whatever the risks are. Then of course, even then, I've been, I was detained in Afghanistan, I was detained in Iraq, detained in Libya, in all those cases with others, and in all those cases, like when I was kicked out of the country in Iraq, for example, right, but I made sure before I was kicked out that that only applied to me, and that there was no issue with the person I was with, the driver that I was with. But it's a challenge. It's definitely a challenge.
Well, let me move on to the next question. How did you immerse yourself enough to learn Pashto, or were you learning the language prior to that?
No, when I moved to Afghanistan, I knew almost nothing about the country except what I read in some books, and I'd actually gone there to teach English initially. And when I got there, turned out that the place that I signed up to teach English didn't exist, so it was a scam. But so I was there, and I didn't have very much money. I had, like, I don't know, $1,000 or something, and so I had I had no choice but to learn the language. I wasn't part of the foreign correspondence network where people come to the country on assignment. They have a fixer, they have a translator. I didn't have a fixer or translator or anything. So that means that the people around me all just spoke Dari, it's the first language I learned, and Pashto. And if you're in a situation where nobody speaks English, you're going to learn the language very quickly, whether you want to or not. So that's basically what happened.
Okay. And the next question, which is actually related, how did you learn Arabic, and how long did it take, and how much Arabic did you know before you traveled to Egypt or Syria?
So Arabic is a much harder language than Pashto or Dari. Pashto and Dari are more or less similar to English in some ways. They're Indo-European languages. Arabic is a Semitic language. So it took much longer, but I didn't know any Arabic when I went to Egypt and Libya. But when I went to Syria, not that first time, but subsequently, I was staying with a family. Again, this family, nobody spoke English in the family. And so it took me a couple of years, but by staying with a family where nobody spoke English, it's kind of an immersion program. And so that's how I was able to learn, which means my colloquial Syrian is much better than my formal Arabic as a result.
So let me ask, are there any, I don't see any other questions in the chat. Does anyone else have any questions, or do we have a way to flag that?
I have a question in the meantime, if I may.
Yes, please.
I'm curious, since I reread the piece you wrote from Syria, Anand, just recently, and one thing that strikes me, even though it describes some very gruesome and horrible things that the Syrian regime had done, there's also a good deal of hope that still remains in that piece, especially among the sort of people who are resisting the regime, and the possibility of their sort of being able to create a revolution that lasts, or create a new government that can represent them and push back against the Assad regime. When you look back on that kind of story, do you feel like you would have framed things differently if you knew what you know now, or what would you do you feel like that it was important to get that message out at that moment?
Probably both. Yeah, it's probably important to get that message out because that's what people were feeling. And the thing is, even at that point, this 2012, we were tending to think of it here as this crazy, brutal civil war, which it was, but there was also something else happening at the same time, which was there was this imagining of a different future that people were undertaking, right? So this town where they were having their kind of local government, and in an area that had dictatorship for 40 years. So both of these things were happening simultaneously: horrible death and destruction, and a sort of political flourishing. And I thought, and I still think that's an important message to get out, not just about Syria, but more generally about what human beings are capable of, and how essential kind of political imagination is to people, that even when they're under the bombs, they're thinking about how to live a better life, so I think that's an important message to get out. But maybe, if I were to do it now, I would have maybe struck a more tragic note to the hope than maybe I did at the time.
Yeah. I actually have a similar question about Afghanistan, that given that we now have more of a picture of what the Taliban is doing, reflecting on your story, the other women's story, how do you feel about it now, Anand? Would you have changed it in any way? Do you feel you struck the right balance in terms, in a sense, it wasn't a balance because you weren't choosing, whether it was the Taliban or the US that did this damage, but, how did you feel in terms of getting the right tone for that piece?
Yeah, I think I wasn't surprised by the subsequent events. And the piece even talks about how
it does.
Taliban don't offer much to people except that it's not a war. And so I think, and in terms of balance, and in one way, it's not a balanced piece because it's only telling the story of those who are living in the war zone, which is only part of it, right? Is a whole other story to be told, but the thing is, I think it has been told and told well by many people. So I saw the piece itself as kind of contributing to a larger balance, if that makes sense.
That does make
our
sense.
understanding.
I have another question. What drives you, Anand, to go into the most dangerous places in the world?
Well, I don't like danger. I'm not an adrenaline junkie or anything like that. Like I'm sometimes with photographers and they love to go right in between the bullets, and I'm not actually like that. I'm interested in the sorts of things that the sorts of human experiences that could be translatable for us as Americans. I'm very much interested in writing as an American. So when we think about conflict, we've had one idea of what America means in the world and what American war means in the world. And I thought it was pretty urgent for us as American citizens and Americans in general to understand what our role in the world is. And so that's partly what drives me. And then in terms of the work in the Arab world, we see what's happening with democracy in our country in the last few years. And I am driven by people's experimentations with democracy. My book now, current book, is about that, driven by people's attempts to imagine different ways of living. And because I think we need that. And Chris, to talk about your question of hope, I think that, whereas the war is kind of a sober assessment of what our country's role has been. I mean, looking at democracy, whether failed democracy experiments or successful ones, is just towards how we can try to have a little bit of hope in what I think a lot of us agree is kind of dark times.
I have the next question. How do you juggle your work as a professor and a journalist? And what advice do you have for younger journalists who wants to cover international stories? I'm currently working at a local paper and received a grant for an investigative story abroad. I'll be taking unpaid leave to go work on it. It would be useful to hear more from you about how you manage it all.
Well, my main advice for if you want to work internationally is to try to learn the language if the place you're going to doesn't speak English as a primary language, and to try as much as possible to develop a sort of expertise in a way. And it's a little different from how we're normally taught about journalism, I think, where we tend to see ourselves as kind of these sort of neutral, objective truth tellers who are going to go and get the opinions of various experts who studied this and know this better than us. But I think actually, if you really try to study a particular issue, it'll help your journalism tremendously. I mean, I can't tell you how many times where I've been in a situation where I would ask a question, like in the Other Afghan Women, there's a warlord named Amir Dado, and the women that I interviewed initially talked about him. Right. So like they told me other parts of their lives. It just because I happened to have studied this area and read everything about the area and realized there is a warlord by this name, I asked them, and then all these stories came out about, so it's a lot of it's about knowing what's the right questions to ask. And that really means having a kind of expertise, like really doing your homework and really trying to read everything that's been written academically and journalistically so that you feel like you're asking the right questions. And then the other part of the question was about how I balance being a professor, a journalist. Well,
yes, and a journalist.
Mostly by not writing very much, I guess. I write one article every couple of years at this point, but that's a pace that's good for me, I think. And the good thing about being professor is I get healthcare, so that's the main reason. So.
Yeah. Do your journalistic and academic publications, do they sort of draw on the same material, or do you, or is that separate? Does your work dovetail in that sense?
Oh, it definitely dovetails. They're always, I'm always drawing from one to the other.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's see. While waiting for more questions, I'd like to ask, Anand, how did you get into narrative writing in particular? As in, was it something that you studied? Did you teach yourself? I mean, I'm always interested in how people get into this kind of writing and essentially how they learn it and practice it.
Well, I used to read Harper's, actually. It's true. I think when I was a physicist, I think Harper's was one of the few magazines I subscribed to. And
that's great.
Yeah, so I was moved by various, or you're moved by good writing, or you're moved by good storytelling. And so I was moved by various, I can mention, if people are interested, examples of great writing and storytelling, and so I thought, oh, I should try to do that. But that's where that's the genesis of it.
Oh, okay. And
actually, I'm curious, like, you don't have to name names, but were you primarily excited by conflict journalism, or by nature writing, or like what political pieces? Like, what were the things that were sort of
everything? I mean, I liked all sorts of good writing, but yeah, conflict journalism. When I wanted to be a conflict journalist, that's what I was looking to almost as a model. But some of my favorite pieces from various magazines. I mean, there's like Catherine Brood has a piece called The Marriage Cure. I don't know if you remember that from a few years ago. So the thing is, like, I read that piece and I was like, wow, I want to do what she does. This is an amazing piece. So there's lots of examples, like Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc's book, Random Family, as an example of great narrative writing. There's a lot out there, and so these aren't conflict based.
Right, but they still, in the chat, we have a couple of links to Anand's New Yorker piece and also to Anand's Harper piece. Let me ask, are there any other questions at this point? Okay, sounds like people aren't sending this in. So Chris, how did you get involved in this kind of work?
Well, I definitely came at it from the literary side of things. My first job was at the Paris Review, and I edited fiction there, also poetry. And it was only when I arrived at Harper's that I sort of got thrown into working more directly with journalism. Although I will say that when I was at Paris Review, the head of that publication was Philip Gurevich, who is a fantastic journalist and reported from Rwanda and many other places around the world. So I was sort of steeped in some of that writing through him. But yeah, I mean, my original life plan was to become an academic, and then got this, what I thought was going to be like a one-year job at Paris Review, and just really loved being involved so directly with writing every day that I quickly decided that I was not going to go back to academia. So I was on leave from a PhD, and I never went back, and I don't regret that either. I'm glad to. History.
I think we are about up to our time, so let me ask whether we have anybody else who's interested. Do we have any other questions? But also, Anand and Chris, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about? And Anand, I am curious, so you're working on a book now, and is your book set in a particular place, or if it is essentially about democracy, is it based on reporting in different places? I mean, tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, this is a book about a city that overthrew the government and had an 18-month experiment in democracy, which took place in Syria.
Okay.
And Syria is a dictatorship for 40 years. There was just state-run newspapers, all unions and political parties were banned. And so in this 18-month period, all of a sudden you had this effervescence of political parties, 11 different newspapers, conservative, left-wing, Islamist, everything secular. The city was governed by a Senate and councils. It was, I think, one of the most fully realized democratic experiments in recent times, not just with Syria, but probably anywhere. And it failed after 18 months. So the book is really about how this experiment came together, why it failed, and what lessons that might give us about democracy today.
Okay. And have you thought about where your next trip would be, or what reporting you might do next?
Well, I'm a little bit tired of doing conflict reporting and foreign reporting, so I'm looking for stories that are closer to home, perhaps, or in Europe. I would definitely go on assignment to Europe if anybody wants to.
It's always Ukraine.
No, except for Ukraine. Sorry, anywhere in Western Europe. I'll go anywhere in Western Europe.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I
Time
think
to report that Hawaii story.
I'll definitely report a Hawaii story.
Yeah.
I think our time is up. So if anyone has any other questions, please do send them along or ask. And otherwise, thank you very much to Anand and to Chris. We really appreciate you being here, and thank you for your thoughtful insights. This has been a very interesting conversation. Take care, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.